Fellow mourners, ladies and gentlemen, I now wish to call upon our father and leader who had known Ambassador Kumalo for many, many years and had sent him on various dependable missions here at home and abroad. I would like, without much further ado, to call none other than our former president, His Excellency President Thabo Mbeki.
That's all right. Thanks a lot, Program Director, and your fellow Program Director, Professor Pichana. Sistiki, Manguchana, Umkulwa wetu, Henry Kumalo, and the rest of the Kumalo family, as well as the Matikizela family. Nkosazana, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Funisiwaku, and fellow mourners. I shan't be long today because Nkosazana is going to speak on my behalf today. So as we've been sitting here, we've been watching the messages on the board behind me here. Many of them from people who served with Dumisani at the United Nations. I'm going to read something here which comes from somebody about Dumisani, from somebody who was never near the United Nations, was never a diplomat, a fellow African. And indeed today I thought that we would all of us be saying things as South Africans, as comrades of Dumisani, as friends, as relatives, things that would all of us expect. So I thought today perhaps I'll get some other people to talk about Dumisani rather than ourselves. And so that's why I was saying I'm going to read just now a message which came 4 days ago from a Ugandan. This is Judge Bani Afako, who, as I say, was never a diplomat and therefore looked at Dumisani from afar. But I think the reason that he could say the things he says about Dumisani showed what kind of impact Dumisani had, certainly on our continent. And Judge Afago says to me, it was with real shock and profound sorrow that I heard earlier from Alan that Ambassador Kumalo had passed away. He was an outstanding diplomat, a giant in all senses, a very safe pair of hands with the African agenda on the international arena. He is a huge loss to our continent at a time when we needed his large hands to remain on the busy deck. I think we must take that to heart, what Bani Afago is saying, that we needed his large hands to remain on the busy deck. That's the time our continent faces. And I do hope that having heard what this Ugandan colleague says, we should try and respond at a time when we needed his large hands to remain on the busy deck. He says that because a lot of the people on our continent had indeed expected of us as South Africans that our large hands would remain on the busy deck to help our continent to overcome its problems. Sam Gulube spoke correctly about what Dumisani did in the course of the struggle to defeat the apartheid regime in the States. Some people are prepared to do a book called No Easy Victories, as Mandla has just said. The title was No Easy Victories, African Liberation and American Activists Over Half a Century, from 1950 to 2000. And they interviewed Dumisani for this book. And this is what they said about him. These are Americans. And they say from the Phelps-Stokes Fund, Dumisani moved in 1980 to the American Committee on Africa and the Africa Fund. And as project director of these organizations, Dumisani Kumalo became man on the road for divestment, an indispensable organizer in the campaign to divest funds from corporations and financial institutions in the United States that were involved in South Africa. He traveled from state to state, from college campus to campus, educating ordinary Americans about South Africa and showing them there was something important they could do to support the freedom struggle. In the course of his travels, the South African-born Kumalo learned the United States, its local, state, and national political structures, the role of non-governmental organizations such as educational institutions, churches, trade unions, civil rights groups, and building on the groundwork laid by organizers in the 1960s and 70s, he helped nurture a nationwide grassroots network demanding economic sanctions against South Africa. And they said, as indeed Sam Gulube said, and our obituary said, that despite the veto by President Ronald Reagan, the US Congress overruled the president and instituted those sanctions in 1986. I think we need all of us to understand the importance of that victory, that the US Congress could overrule President Reagan because of their support for the struggle for the liberation of South Africa. There was a view in the Reagan administration, which was, in the words they used, that South Africa was too important to be left to the South Africans. And they understood very well what they would do about South Africa. This South Africa was too important to be left to the South Africans. And that's the importance of that overriding of that veto. Because the US Congress, and Sam Gulube was saying, pushed by the American people, said no, the South Africans would indeed decide the future of South Africa. Thank you very much indeed to Dumisani, who contributed that much to defeat that view that our future would be determined by other people other than ourselves. Let me read something which appeared in the Sunday Times, the South African Sunday Times, on the 2nd of February in 2003. And it says, it is an icy Wednesday morning in New York, and Dumisani Shedrack Kumalo, South Africa's ambassador to the United Nations, is running again. He has just been told that an important vote is about to take place in the UN General Assembly, and he rushes out to his office, jumps into a car, and gets dropped off at the United Nations headquarters. Kumalo has become one of the most important and powerful politicians in the UN. Although acknowledged across the spectrum as popular and hardworking since his appointment in April 1999, respect for him has grown with the crisis surrounding Iraq. Kumalo, representing South Africa as leader of the non-aligned movement and the African Union, essentially opposed the US by requesting that debates on Iraq take place not behind the closed doors of the 15-member Security Council, but in the General Assembly, where all countries could take part. And the Sunday Times said he made it possible for the world to express its views on the United States' intention to attack Iraq. Until Kumalo's intervention in October, the debate had been limited to the ambassadors of the US, Russia, China, Britain, and France, no longer. We cannot dictate to the Security Council, but we as UN member states do have the right to have our views expressed before them, so they know how we feel about this particular issue, Kumalo said at the time. And the debate led to so many countries expressing outrage at the prospect of war that UN weapons inspectors were dispatched to Iraq with the world assured, at least for the time being, that they would be allowed to do their work. The debate also gave notice to the US that the world disapproved of its belligerence. And last week, said the Sunday Times then, when UN inspection leaders Hans Blix and Mohammed El Baradei reported to the UN, Kumalo managed to ensure that their report was available to all members of the UN, not just the Security Council. And these interventions have led to acknowledgement that the debate on the war on terror has many sides, and that developing countries can raise a voice against wars that have the potential to devastate them. All we have done in South Africa is to prove that you do not need to be in the Security Council to contribute to international peace and security. We have forced the only public debate on Iraq where more than 100 countries spoke, Kumalo said. And he said if the UN were really about doing its work, then it would be dealing with issues of poverty and underdevelopment. And those are the issues the UN should be about. War only adds to misery. Kumalo's efforts at the UN mean he's always in demand, always on the move between meetings and speeches and functions. But these days, everyone at the UN knows that when the man who is always running stops to talk about Iraq, a lot of important people stop to reflect. And that includes the leaders of the world's most powerful country, the United States of America. I thought that was a remarkable report by the Sunday Times. It's what we would say, but this time it's what they say. And I think that is to underline the truthfulness of what is said about who Dumisani was and what he meant, not only to ourselves, but to the rest of the world. And it tells a story of where South Africa stood at the time in terms of the system of international relations. And I think we need to say this, that his immediate boss, throughout these years that he was at the Security Council, was Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. This was an outstanding African and an internationalist, a Pan-Africanist. And what he was doing at the United Nations was part of the process of building the liberated South Africa. We're very, very honored indeed as the Thabo Mbeki Foundation that he became our first CEO in 2011. When we approached him to take this job, he did not hesitate. and understood very, very well the challenges that he would face as that CEO, and indeed discharged his responsibilities as that CEO with great distinction. It was therefore very, 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 very sad indeed that Dumisani suffered a stroke, fell ill in 2015, and therefore had to leave. But by the time he left, he had established the foundation, and indeed it had grown roots. So we're saying farewell to somebody here who has been spoken about by people other than ourselves. And they've communicated a message that indeed today we say a final farewell to somebody that all of us should forever be proud of. Somebody who, as I've said in the past, is one of our unsung heroes. And therefore, I think it's going to be important, even after we've parted with Dumisani, that we find the right songs to sing about this man who was so important to the liberation of our people and so important to the building of the new South Africa. The rest will be said by Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. Thank you very much.